The deck burned beneath my boots as flames coiled along the twisted wreckage where the steel had split and the flight deck had folded in on itself. Smoke poured upward in thick columns, staining the tropical sky with darkness and carrying the harsh bite of aviation fuel mixed with another stench I refused to name. Through the suffocating haze, I could still catch the distant growl of engines, the sound of our Hellcats fading as they pressed their attack against the Japanese fleet. The carrier beneath me was dying, but our squadrons were still out there, still striking, and we were determined to see that they had everything they needed to complete the mission. My name is Lieutenant Commander Robert M. McPhersonin, Air Group Commander aboard the USS Princeton on October 24th, 1944, a day when we discovered that triumph at sea could shatter the spirit and lift it at the same time, filling the chest with unbearable sorrow and unshakable pride. The Philippine Sea lay vast and endless in every direction, its surface shimmering like molten gold beneath the light of dawn. I had stood on Princeton's flight deck in the early hours, watching as my pilots strapped in and checked their controls for the operation ahead. She was a small carrier, little more than 11,000 tons, but she was fast, reliable, and carried the nickname Sweet Pea among her crew. Together with the rest of Task Group 38.3, she carved her way through gentle swells, a single piece of Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. Beyond the curve of the horizon, the most massive sea battle ever to be fought was already beginning to take shape. "Skipper," called Lieutenant Jimmy Morrison, my wingman and as steady a flyer as any commander could ask for. "Seems like we finally get a crack at the fleet." I answered with a brief nod, glancing at my watch. The time was 05:30 hours, and reports from the search squadrons had just come in. The northern Japanese force, commanded by Admiral Ozawa, had been sighted some 200 miles away, 4 carriers with their escorts sailing together. We did not yet grasp that it was a decoy, part of a greater Japanese design meant to drag Halsey's fleet away from Leyte. At that moment, it looked like the chance we had long been waiting for, a full carrier engagement that could cripple Japanese sea power once and for all. The Princeton carried a modest air group of around 45, planes, Hellcats for fighter cover, Helldivers for bombing runs, and Avengers for torpedo work. We lacked the size of the great fleet carriers like Essex or Lexington, but we made up for it with precision and speed. Captain William Buracker had drilled us constantly, hammering home discipline until even the smallest details were second nature, and by then it showed in every launch, every recovery, every formation in the air. The loudspeakers cracked to life, calling all pilots to the ready rooms. The words sharp and urgent. "This is not a drill! Repeat, this is not a drill!" In the briefing room, the orders were clear and blunt. Intelligence confirmed that Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were sailing with little more than token air support. Most of Japan's veteran flyers had already been lost in the grinding battles of the past year, and those who remained were inexperienced replacements barely trained for combat. Our task was to strike with overwhelming force, joining the other carriers of Task Group 38.3 to finish what was left of the enemy's carrier fleet. I gathered my men on the deck before the launch and reminded them of what was at stake. Those ships out there are the same ones that struck Pearl Harbor. Zuikaku was there when this war began. Today we put an end to it. At 0800 hours, the launching began. One after another, our planes thundered down the deck and rose into the clear morning sky, their engines leaving trails of power behind them. I climbed into my own fighter, an F-6F-5 Hellcat, Bureau number 70143, a machine I had flown for 6 months and grown attached to. She wore the Navy's deep blue paint with white markings, armed with 6 50 caliber guns that had never failed me in a fight. As the squadron formed up and turned northeast toward the enemy fleet, I thought about how far we had come. Only a few years earlier, Japan's Navy had looked unbeatable. Their pilots were veterans, their machines first class, and their tactics sharp and creative. But we had adapted battle by battle, learning their habits and turning them into weaknesses. Now the balance of the war had shifted entirely, and with Leyte ahead of us, we knew it was our turn to finish what had begun at Pearl Harbor. Our strike group was small compared to what the larger carriers could send aloft: a dozen Hellcats, 8 Helldivers, and 6 Avengers. Yet in the hands of practiced pilots, even that force could deal a devastating blow. The flight northward took just over an hour, and as the minutes passed, the airwaves began to fill with shouts. Tally-ho, tally-ho, 4 carriers spotted bearing 040, distance 12 miles. There they were at last, spread wide across the sea, their escorts arrayed in loose defensive screens. Even from 15,000 feet I could see the truth. These were not the proud, dangerous task groups that had once cut across the Pacific in 1942. Their decks looked tired and nearly empty of aircraft, just as our intelligence had suggested. Most of their air power had been stripped away to support operations over the Philippines. I keyed my radio and gave the order. Princeton, strike leader to all planes. We're going for the big carrier. That's Zuikaku. Hellcats, sweep the skies. Helldivers and Avengers, hold until I give the signal, then strike from multiple angles. Make this count. Barely 20 Japanese fighters rose to challenge us, a pitiful defense for 4 carriers. Our Hellcats carved through them with ruthless ease. Morrison lit up a 0 with a perfect shot, sending it tumbling into the sea, and I saw 2 more enemy fighters torn apart by the guns of my squadron mates. Yet as the dogfight broke up, unease gnawed at me. There were too few planes, too few escorts. The whole formation felt hollow, as though we were striking at a shadow. Only later would we understand that it was a feint, a deliberate lure meant to draw us northward, while the real Japanese battle fleet slipped through San Bernardino Strait to descend on our invasion forces at Leyte. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the enemy carrier directly beneath us. Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, the ship that had been there when the war began, now waiting for our attack. Her flight deck swung into the wind as the crew struggled with everything they had to put a few more planes into the sky, desperate to contribute whatever remained of her strength to the fight. Helldivers, this is strike leader. Begin your run. Repeat, begin now. The SB-2C Helldivers nosed over sharply, their wings slicing the air as they dove almost vertically toward their target, the Japanese carrier below. I watched through the canopy as the first 1,000-pound bomb struck abaft Zuikaku's island, erupting into a towering geyser of flame and smoke. Another bomb plunged through near the bow, exploding deep within her decks, and suddenly the once proud warship that had been part of starting this war was wrapped in fire and devastation. Moments later, the Avengers roared in, flying low over the waves, their Mark 13 torpedoes sliding free and streaking toward Zuikaku's waterline. One missed its mark, but the following 2 slammed home, sending shockwaves through the ship's hull. Through my binoculars, I could see her shudder, rolling heavily to port, speed faltering as frantic damage control teams tried desperately to keep her alive. For us, the flight back toward Princeton should have been the kind of return pilots dream about, the kind that felt like a victory parade in the sky. We had struck hard, and early reports confirmed our task group's coordinated strikes were tearing the Japanese force apart. Zuikaku was fatally wounded, her decks burning, and black pillars of smoke on the horizon showed that her escorts were also under withering attack. But as we neared Task Group 38-3, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Where our own carrier should have been moving in formation with her screen of destroyers, there was only a vast plume of smoke rising against the clear blue of the tropical sky. Then came the voice on the radio, calm, but edged with urgency. Princeton Strike Group, this is Birmingham. Do not approach the task group. Repeat, do not approach. Princeton has been hit and is burning. You are directed to divert and land on Lexington. My stomach dropped, the words hitting harder than flak. In the mere 2 hours we had been gone striking at Ozawa's decoy fleet. Our own ship had somehow been struck a mortal blow. As we approached, The full scene of disaster unfolded beneath us. Princeton lay crippled, motionless in the water. Her flight deck torn and buckled, flames pouring from every opening of her superstructure. The light cruiser Birmingham had pulled alongside, blasting streams of seawater into the inferno, while destroyers Morrison, Irwin, and Cushing circled in a defensive screen, their guns manned and watchful. "Dear God," Morrison whispered. Over the radio, "What happened to her?" We would only piece it together later, and the truth was both simple and tragic. While we had been hammering Ozawa's carriers to the north, Japanese aircraft from land bases in the Philippines had slipped through and struck back. A single Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, flying low and fast, had evaded our fighter patrols and released a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb directly into Princeton's deck. Normally, a lone hit like that might cripple a ship, but not doom it. This time was different. The bomb tore through the flight deck and exploded inside the hangar where 6 Avengers sat fully fueled and armed for the next launch. The detonation was catastrophic, ripping a 60-foot gash across the deck, igniting aviation fuel that poured into roaring fires, setting off secondary explosions, and killing or maiming scores of men in an instant. From 5,000 feet up, I could only see shapes moving in the chaos, sailors appearing as tiny dots as they fought to save their carrier. Down below, temperatures climbed past 1,000 degrees, smoke turned the compartments black, and ammunition cooked off in violent bursts. Any ordinary crew might have broken under those conditions, but the men of Princeton refused to surrender their ship without a fight. Later, when I spoke with survivors, I heard stories of raw courage that still chilled me years after. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Boats O'Malley, a veteran of 20 years and nearly every battle since Coral Sea, had been in the hangar when the bomb exploded. The blast threw him 30 feet across the bay, yet he rose to his feet and immediately began shouting commands, rallying the survivors of the hangar deck crew. "You men! Ordnance is cooking off! Get those hoses running and move the wounded topside!" Around him, aviation fuel ran in rivers of fire, metal shrieked as it warped under heat, and shells detonated every few seconds. But O'Malley and his men held their ground, spraying water into the flames and carrying the injured through smoke thick enough to choke the lungs raw. Among them was Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez, just 19 years old, on his first combat cruise. When trapped with 3 badly wounded sailors behind a wall of flames, he did not run. He drenched his clothes in seawater, wrapped the men in wet blankets, and carried them one by one through 50 feet of blazing fuel to safety. Months later, when I asked him about that day, he shook his head. "I wasn't brave. I was scared to death. But they were my shipmates. You don't leave your shipmates behind." Up on the bridge, Captain Baracker fought his own desperate battle. With main power gone and radios silenced, he sent runners carrying orders through choking passageways. The bridge filled with smoke, the bulkheads burned to the touch, and reports came in that ammunition was exploding in the hangar, threatening the magazines below. His executive officer, Commander John Hoskins, delivered the message with grim urgency. Baracker fell silent for a moment that felt endless, weighing the fate of his ship. Princeton was his command, his responsibility, and abandoning her was unthinkable. Yet the lives of the 1,400 men under him were worth more than any steel deck. At last, in a quiet voice, he gave the order. "Pass the word. Prepare to abandon ship. But keep the fire parties at work as long as possible. We're not done yet." As Princeton's crew fought against impossible odds, 200 miles north, our strike against Ozawa's carriers was reaching its peak, and the reports filtering back painted a picture of devastation beyond anything we could have hoped for Zuikaku. The last remaining carrier from the attack on Pearl Harbor was slipping beneath the waves with most of her aircraft still locked inside her hangars. Zuiho had suffered several direct bomb hits and leaned sharply to starboard. Chitose was already gone, destroyed by a coordinated torpedo strike launched by planes from Lexington. Chiyoda, the smallest of the Japanese carriers, lay motionless, in the water, engulfed in flames from bow to stern. Yet the true significance of our victory was not measured only in the number of ships sunk. What mattered even more was the total destruction of Japan's carrier-based aviation. In just a few hours, we had wiped out over 100 Japanese aircraft along with their veteran pilots, men who could never be replaced. The handful of planes that managed to take off were swiftly shot down by our patrols or destroyed when their carriers were struck. This battle marked the end of Japan's carrier fleet as a viable combat force. Never again would they pose a challenge to American dominance in the Pacific. It was a triumph remembered alongside Midway and the Philippine Sea, though it was overshadowed for us by the fact that our own ship was burning as the fight reached its height. I was finally cleared to land aboard Lexington at 14:45, almost 6 hours after leaving Princeton that morning. My Hellcat snagged the number 3 arresting wire and came to a jarring halt, and as I climbed from the cockpit, I saw Princeton still burning in the distance, ringed by rescue ships but beyond saving. Our debriefing was brief and tinged with sadness. We had achieved our objective. The Japanese carrier fleet had been destroyed. But Princeton, our home, our base, our piece of America, was lost, and nothing could be done to save her. At 15:23, while Birmingham was still alongside battling fires, disaster struck. Flames reached Princeton's bomb magazine, and $3,400 tons of explosives detonated in a thunderous blast heard 30 miles away. I stood on Lexington's flight deck, binoculars in hand, as the explosion tore through her. One moment Princeton was there, still burning but fighting. The next, she vanished in a towering pillar of fire and smoke that rose nearly 2,000 feet. When the smoke cleared, her stern was simply gone. Everything aft of the island had been obliterated, leaving a jagged length of wreckage barely 400 feet long, which rolled over and slipped beneath the surface in minutes. The destruction didn't end with Princeton. Birmingham, alongside and engaged in rescue efforts, bore the brunt of the explosion. Massive chunks of debris crashed down upon her decks, killing 229 sailors and wounding another 420. It was tragedy upon tragedy. Yet what stood out most was the resolve of Birmingham's crew. Even as their own ship was devastated, they pressed on with rescue work, launching boats to recover men from the water, tending to the injured, and fighting fires aboard both ships. Captain Thomas English of Birmingham later wrote in his report that the loss of Princeton was a terrible blow, but the courage of both crews, Princeton's men struggling to save their ship and Birmingham's men risking everything to save their comrades, represented the very finest traditions of the United States Navy. Out of Princeton's crew of about 2,400, 108 were killed and 190 wounded. Given the sheer violence of the explosion, those numbers were considered remarkably light, a testament to training, discipline, and sheer bravery. Boats Alley, the chief petty officer who had led hangar deck evacuations, was among those saved by Birmingham. When I met him 3 days later aboard Lexington, his hands were bandaged and his face was scorched, yet he was already asking when he could return to sea. He told me, "That was a good ship, one of the best I ever served on." But ships can be replaced. What matters is we got most of the boys out and we gave those carriers hell before we lost her. Seaman Rodriguez, just 19, who had carried 3 wounded shipmates through flames and burning fuel, was nominated for the Silver Star. When I asked him about it, he simply shrugged and said, "Anybody would have done the same thing, sir. That's why we're here." Captain Burker went down with his ship, standing on Princeton's bridge, directing evacuations even as the fire closed in. His body was never found, but his leadership in those final hours saved countless lives. As night fell on October 24th, 1944, the magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the greatest naval clash in history, was still raging, but the carrier engagement off Cape Engano had been decisive. Admiral Ozawa's northern force was shattered. All 4 Japanese carriers were gone or sinking, their escorts scattered. Most importantly, Japan's best naval aviators, men who had taken years to train, were gone, lost forever in the Philippine Sea. Strategically, the consequences were enormous. Japan could no longer mount offensive carrier operations. Their once dominant naval air arm was reduced to land-based units flying outdated planes with inexperienced pilots. But this great success came at a heavy price. Princeton was gone, along with 108 men who would never return home. Birmingham, badly damaged, would spend months in repairs, and Princeton's air group was now without a ship, its members adrift, their floating home reduced to debris scattered across the sea floor. 3 weeks later, I found myself aboard the carrier Shangri-La, preparing for the closing operations of the war against Japan. By then, it was clear what Leyte Gulf had meant. We hadn't merely defeated a Japanese task force, we had ended Japan's carrier aviation as a meaningful threat. Yet my thoughts kept returning to Princeton and the men who had perished trying to save her. War often balances victory and tragedy on the edge of a knife, separated only by the thickness of steel or the luck of a single bomb hit. Our mission had been achieved. The Japanese carriers were destroyed, their air groups annihilated, their power in the Pacific broken. But Princeton was gone, taking with her 108 sailors whose only crime was serving their country. They died not in a glorious last stand, but in the grim reality of damage control, battling fires, hauling out the wounded, and struggling to save a ship already doomed. That is the part of naval warfare films rarely capture. For every moment of battle in the skies or gunnery duels at sea, there are endless hours of routine labor, maintenance, and the uncelebrated work of keeping a warship alive in a hostile ocean. Princeton's crew died performing that work, and their sacrifice was as profound as any pilot's victory or any gunner's kill. On that day, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda went down with them, taking roughly 800 Japanese sailors and aviators. With them sank Japan's ability to project air power across the Pacific. It was a victory that shortened the war and saved countless American lives in future battles. When I returned home in 1946, I spoke at Princeton's memorial service in Philadelphia. Standing before the families of those I had served alongside trying to explain their loss, I came to realize that Princeton's story was not just about one ship or one battle. It was about the cost of the freedom we were fighting to secure. Every man who died on Princeton, every sailor wounded on Birmingham, every pilot who fell over the Japanese fleet, they were all part of something greater. Leyte Gulf marked the end of Japan's navy as a real fighting force. Never again would Japanese carriers contest our operations. Never again would their naval aviation darken Pacific skies. Though the war would drag on for 10 more months, Japan's ability to challenge us at sea died with the carriers destroyed off Cape Engano. Princeton perished in flames, but her pilots fought on, and in that fight lay the assurance of victory. The men who fell that day did not die in vain. They gave their lives so future generations could inherit a world where freedom could survive. That legacy is worth dying for, worth remembering, and that is why, even after nearly 8 decades, the story of USS Princeton and her crew is still told with both pride and sorrow. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when their nation needed them most. They were true heroes, not because they sought glory, but because they carried out their duty to the very end. The deck was burning, yet our planes stayed in the fight, and that made all the difference. In memory of the 108 officers and men of USS Princeton CVL 23, who gave their lives in the service of their country, October 24, 1944. Looking back on everything that unfolded, it becomes clear that what happened was more than just a clash of steel and fire. It was a turning point where bravery, sacrifice, and determination shaped the course of history. The loss of Princeton was devastating, but her story did not end in tragedy alone. Her crew's courage in the face of impossible odds and their unwavering commitment to one another became part of a much greater victory. The Japanese carrier force was broken forever, and with it, the last hope of Japan challenging America's dominance at sea. Yet what lingers most is not the numbers of ships sunk or planes destroyed, but the memory of those men who gave everything so others could live. Their actions remind us that war is not only fought with weapons, but also with loyalty, endurance, and selfless devotion. In remembering Princeton and her crew, we honor the truth